I am Sandeepan, Director at the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, or FAS as it is better known as. We are a 2-decade-old research organization engaged in deep and scientific studies of the contemporary Indian countryside. We function as a network of young and senior scholars, academic and other scholars from various institutes, organizations, and university departments in India and around the world. We study rural and agrarian India both from the perspective of policies and the changing social and economic structures. On behalf of the FAS team, I welcome you all once again to this webinar on a topic whose contemporary relevance in the context of the farmers' protests that continue to simmer in the country cannot be overstated. The various demands that are being raised by these protests and their multidimensional assessments by the academics, journalists, and policymakers cannot and should not be isolated from the larger trends of agricultural policy framework that has been followed in India for the last few decades. Agriculture has always been an important sector for India's economic structure from the perspective of both production and the welfare and livelihood of a vast majority of the Indian population. This importance was reflected in the planning and policy framework of the country, at least since the period of the Green Revolution, for the next 3 decades or so. In the last few decades, however, while the importance of this sector continues, it perhaps does not find adequate reflection in the policy framework and therefore in the budgetary numbers. This is the premise for today's discussion, and we are glad to have with us Professor R. Ramakumar from the School of Development Studies, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai, and the author of the report on public spending on agriculture in India in the last 1 decade, published by the Foundation in 2022. We shall share the link of that report on the Q&A box for those who are interested. Professor Ramakumar has recently published a book. Maybe I'll just show the book on my screen. This is a book which, on a very related topic, Distress in the Fields, Indian Agriculture After Economic Liberalization. Welcome, Professor Ramakumar. We are also very happy to be joined by Dr. Deepak Johnson, a JSPS postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of Economic Research, Hitotsubashi University, Japan. Deepak is the author of a forthcoming report of the Foundation on trends in costs and incomes from crop production in India. This report will be made public later this month. Deepak will lead the conversation today. So without further ado, let me call upon Deepak to take over the proceedings. Deepak, please.
Thank you, Sandeepan and the Foundation for Agrarian Studies for giving us this opportunity to discuss agriculture and budgets in India. Sandeepan gave a introduction to our program and on what context we are meeting. I would just like to highlight the present context a bit more. As many of us would know, the Union budget was presented on February 1st, and it was an interim budget given that this year is an election year. However, the budget presentation was done along with 2 other documents, the Indian Economy Review and the White Paper on the Indian Economy. Both the documents, to quote, took stock of the Indian economy and its journey in the last 10 years, setting out a broader landscape for evaluation of public expenditure in India. We are meeting here in this context, and it is apt that we are looking at agriculture, public spending, and budgets over the last few years rather than confining ourselves to just this budget. Now, public expenditure, as was mentioned by Sandeepan, is a crucial contributor to agriculture development, and government spending in agriculture sector is necessary for ensuring food security and welfare of the rural households. How has it fared over the last 10 years or more? Now, this is the question that we set out to answer through this event. The format for today's event is as follows. I will ask Professor Ramakumar a few questions. Professor Ramakumar will respond to these questions, both on the issues related to the larger issues related to public expenditure on agriculture in India, and some specific questions on items related to the interim budget. We will continue for about 40 to 50 minutes, after which we will take up questions from other participants who have joined us today. So let's get started then. First, Professor Ramakumar, in your recent article reviewing the interim budget's proposals, you suggest that Indian agriculture has been going through a long-term slump. How have you arrived at this conclusion? Do you associate this slump with the widespread agrarian distress? I think a brief assessment of Indian agriculture over the last decade or more will help us see the budget and various policies in this context, especially given that, as Sandeepan said, we are in the midst of a farmers' protest currently.
Thank you, Deepak. Let me first begin by thanking the Foundation for Agrarian Studies and its office bearers for inviting me and organizing this panel discussion. Coming to your question, Deepak, agriculture is a very complex subject, a discipline, and an economy and a society. It consists of different people, different groups of people, different groups of farmers, different types of crops, different types of agroecological regions, and so on. So you will generally see that some crops are more vibrant in their growth patterns compared to other crops. Some regions may be better performing than other regions, and some groups may be better performing than other groups. So these are the complexities and the variations that you will typically see in studying any agricultural economy or society, which is as varied as you would obtain it in India. So it is very clear that in India, there are some crops, there are some groups, and there are some regions which have done relatively better than others over the last decade or so, which is what your question was referring to. But if you look at, certain aggregate trends in the economy, that's what I'm trying to see in answering your question. You will see that the Indian economy as a whole, I'm not talking about agriculture, the Indian economy as a whole has performed relatively poorly after about 2011-12 or so. That comes out from the numbers on not just the growth rates of gross value added in the economy, but also the investment rate, the savings rate, the rate of growth of exports, the growth of bank credit, and so on. So if you look at all these things, all these variables of importance to the economy, you will see that the economy itself has been very poorly performing from about 2011-12 onwards. Now, that is the broad context in which we are looking at it, and that has to do a lot with how the global economy was or has been doing during these periods, and how Indian domestic factors have been in interplay with it. Coming to agriculture, now, if you have this overall economic situation which is in a state of stagnation or slowdown, however you would like to call it, vis-a-vis different indicators, the agricultural sector has been poorly performing as well, along with industry and services. Now, what are the different variables that you could look at to say that agriculture also has been performing poorly, even as I would accept that there are some crops or some regions or some sort of groups in the economy in the rural areas which are doing better than others. You will see some pockets of vibrancy here and there, but the overall story is that of a slowdown of agricultural growth. Let's begin with the index of agricultural production. Now, if you compare the index of agricultural production between, say, 2003-4 and 11-12, and the period after 2011-12, you'll very clearly see that the index of industrial production would clearly slow down across these two periods, from about 3.1% in the previous period that I'm referring to about 2.7% or so in the period after 2011-12. That is index of agricultural production. Now, if you take the index of agricultural productivity or yields, here the slowdown is even sharper. In fact, the growth rate of the index of yields in the period after 2011-2 was only about 1.7% or 1.8%. So along with production, you also see a slowdown in the growth of productivity also in the Indian agricultural economy. I'm not saying productivity has fallen in absolute terms. It has not, but its growth rate has slowed down. That is what you see. Now, that's particularly worrying because our yield gaps are very wide. We need to quickly narrow in the yield gaps and so on. So that's a real crisis we have at hand. So that is one point there. Overall, agricultural growths have not been higher in this decade. Second is, how have incentives to farmers been in this period? If we consider that aspect, one indicator that I have taken in my analysis is what I call as the agricultural sectoral deflator, which provides you with some indication of how the terms of trade to agriculture to farmers has been. What does this calculation imply? We basically calculate a difference between two growth rates. The growth rates of the gross value added in agriculture at current prices and the growth rate of gross value added in agriculture at constant prices. So if the difference is widening, this clearly would mean that current prices are actually rising much faster compared to the base year. But if the difference is actually narrowing, you would actually see that the current prices are continuing to be closer to the benchmark base year. In other words, agricultural prices are not rising. Terms of trade are actually shifting away from the farmer. That is what you see in agriculture in the very same period that I'm referring to as a slowdown of growth rates. You will see that the sectoral deflator in agriculture fell very sharply from about 2011-12, and it currently is about 3. The difference in growth rates currently stands at around 3. So you have a shift of terms of trade against agriculture. Agricultural prices are not rising as compared to the previous year. Number 2. Number 3 is the fact that, okay, agricultural prices are not rising, but agricultural input prices have continued to rise, as we know very clearly, particularly in the event of the wars in Ukraine and so on. Agricultural input prices, particularly those of fertilizers and other chemicals, have risen very sharply. The prices of seeds have risen sharply. The prices of various other inputs have also risen. Diesel, electricity, all these have risen over this period. So if you look at Commission for Agricultural Costs and Prices data, the costs have risen very sharply over the last decade. Now, but agricultural prices are not rising, which is what we just saw. Now, one instrument that the government has to deal with this problem is the minimum support price. Now, the minimum support price can rise and actually ameliorate this problem to a large extent, assuming that everyone has access to MSPs and so on, which is something that we will come to later. Now, if you look at the MSPs are also growing slower in the decade that we are referring to. The MSPs used to grow in the major crops at about 8 to 9% per year between 2003-4 and 11-12. But after 12-13 or so, you will see that the MSPs are annually rising at a growth rate of just about 4.5% to 5% only. So that is another indication that we have that all is not well. The fourth indicator that I consider is that of farmers' incomes. As you may remember, this government had made a very bombastic claim in 2014-15 that it would double the incomes of farmers between 2015 and 2022. Now, it has curiously disappeared from the public discourse. That claim or that variable itself has curiously disappeared. There is, of course, no data to refer to for the most recent periods. That's for sure. But the last data point that we have, which is 2018-19, if you compare the situation assessment surveys of 2012-13 and 2018-19, and you consider the incomes from cultivation for agricultural households as they are defined in the survey, you will see that in real terms, of course, in nominal terms, they have risen, of course, but in real terms, deflated appropriately, you will see that incomes from cultivation have actually grown at minus 1.4% between these two time periods. We don't have further data, but very clearly what we have shows that incomes are not rising and the tendency is for incomes to fall in absolute terms in real terms. Now, two more indicators can be considered to complete the story. One is that of rural employment. The other is that of rural wages. If you consider rural employment, you very clearly see that rural employment levels continue to be higher in 22-23 compared to what they were in 2011-12. They are higher than the figures in 2011-12, both for male workers and for female workers. That is very clear. Now, whatever increase of labor force participation in rural areas or a fall of rural unemployment rates that you see between 2018-19 and 22-23 has not taken you back to 2011-12 levels. That's my first point. But the second point is that is wholly composed of, or very largely composed of, some kind of a reverse structural change in the economy. In other words, you have a crowding in of agriculture, which we saw during COVID. A lot of people lost urban jobs, came to rural areas and crowded agriculture, and those who were employed in agriculture rose remarkably during 2020, 21 and 22. But in 22-23 also you see a similar trend continuing. They are not actually going back to urban areas to work because there are no jobs out there. They're continuing to remain in agriculture, and these workers are largely self-employed in agriculture, and that too women. So the rise that you see in labor force participation or the fall of unemployment is largely composed of female self-employed workers in agriculture. Now, that's very clearly not necessarily a wage-paying employment. It's largely family labor of some sort that we see because it's self-employed, not wage-employed. So that is one important problem that you see, because this is happening in the context of a fall in prices, absence of MSP rises, and incomes not rising, as we saw from the situation assessment survey. So unemployment is also continuing to be a serious crisis in rural areas. Now, finally, coming to rural wages, there is a recent paper that Professor Usami and Rindam Das have in the Review of Agrarian Studies, but there are other studies as well, which very clearly show that rural wages, in real terms, have not risen after 2016-17. From 2016-17, rural wages are largely constant in real terms. But in the last 2 years, about 21-22 onwards, they're actually falling in real terms. This is also because, this is not surprising, because you see a crowding in of agriculture by workers. So it should not be considered as surprising. But it is clearly a disquieting trend for sure that you see in rural areas. So considering all these together, I'm able to confidently say that the agricultural sector in India has been in the midst of a slightly long-term problem. This problem is that of growth rates. This problem is that of productivity. This problem is that of lack of employment generation. This problem is that of absence of growth of wages and incomes.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Ramakumar, for a brief but very comprehensive answer to the question. And you listed 6 indicators. We will come to that a little later, especially on rural unemployment and employment. I have a question regarding that a bit later. But we talked about the indicators that suggest that there is a problem. Now, how about the solution, which is also something that we are trying to address here, about the public spending? You are part of the Foundation for Agrarian Studies' project on public spending on agriculture in India that examined the government spending in agriculture from 2010-11 to 2019-20. And the indicator that was used was the share of government spending in, as a share of gross value added in agriculture. And it had some crucial findings. One of the main findings was that there was an inadequate rate of spending on agriculture when compared with the steady contribution of the sector towards the economy. Now, another one which you and other authors of the report noted was that there was a sudden increase in expenditure by Ministry of Agriculture and Farmers Welfare under the broad head of crop husbandry after 2018-19 due to the introduction of PM Kisan. Now, how do you contrast this with the overall spending within the sector? Do you think that even though it has risen in one particular subsector within agriculture, there are some essential needs that have remained unmet, given that all the indicators that you have pointed to show that there is some sort of a problem here? Now, how do we see this? Like, do we contrast this with other subcomponents within agriculture expenditure?
Deepak, if you want to look at public expenditures or budgetary expenditures in agriculture, I'm going to once again step back and look at the economy as a whole. Okay? And if you look at the economy as a whole, what clearly comes out is the last decade or so, from about 2012-13 or 13-14 onwards, if you look at it, the overall expenditures of the economy as a share of the GDP have fallen. Okay, so you have been going through, in a macroeconomic sense, if you look at it in the aggregate, India is going through a period of contractionary expenditures. Public expenditures are not rising in general. I'm not talking about agriculture, in general. And one of the important reasons why public expenditure is not rising, I'm talking about revenue expenditure in particular, but capital expenditure in any case constitutes only a small percentage. So I'm not getting there, but we can come to that towards the end if you wish. But if you look at revenue expenditures in particular, as a share of the GDP, you see a remarkable fall during the last decade. That's the first point to begin with. Why does it happen? It happens largely because of two reasons. One, your tax GDP ratios are not rising at all. Your tax GDP ratios are stubbornly constant at about 10 to 10.5% of the GDP over the last 10 years or so. So your tax revenues are not rising. Please discount all the news items that you will see in pink press, that GST income as this month has increased by that much and this much and so on. They're all completely misleading. What you need to look at is to patiently look at annual figures over a longer period. If you look at annual figures over a longer period and discount the monthly bombastic claims, you will actually see that nothing has changed. You have a stubbornly constant tax to GDP ratio in the economy, and you have a falling revenue expenditure to GDP ratio in the economy. Now, these are the two broad trends that you very clearly see. And this is why we have to say that we live in a fiscally conservative era. The regime ideologically is committed to fiscal conservatism, to reduction of fiscal deficit and so on. And outside the two extraordinary COVID years, they have largely been moving closer and closer to meeting a 3% target of fiscal deficit for sure. Come to agriculture, this is reflected in agriculture also. If you look at, that's what the report on public spending of the Foundation for Agrarian Studies very clearly shows. What did we do? We looked at agricultural expenditures as a share of the total expenditure of the union and state governments. We also looked at the same as a share of agricultural GVA, that is gross value added. Now, if you look at both these variables or both these ratios, so to say, you'll see that the agricultural expenditure as share of total public expenditure fell, of union plus states, fell from about 11% in 2010 to about 9.5% in 2019, just before COVID. That's what we are referring to. Similar is the case if you look at it with as a share of the agricultural GVA also. You'll see that that has fallen from about 20% to about 19% between 2010 and 2019. So that's very clear. Absolute numbers may have risen, but as a share of the agricultural GDP, how much are you spending? If you look at it if you look at that as a ratio, you see that the ratio is very clearly falling in line with what is happening in the overall economy, which is the fall of expenditure to GDP ratio. Now, this is what the report, FAS report, very clearly showed. It also showed that expenditures have been falling in the Department of Fertilizers, in the Department of Chemicals, and so on, which have a bearing on what happens in agriculture. But the only component which is rising is that of crop husbandry. That too, where a particular scheme was introduced in 2018-19, which was called Prime Minister PM Kisan, which is the short form of it, Kisan Samman Nidhi, as it is called, which entails a payment of rupees 6,000 per farmer per year in agriculture. In agriculture. So the government essentially aimed to give this to 14.5 crore households when it was initially envisaged, but it has not been able to pay it for more than 8 to 8.5 crore households at any point of time. the key problem with this scheme is, number one, it is very small. 6,000 rupees per year essentially means about 450 rupees or so per month for a 5-member household. This almost boils down to nothing if you look at it. If you look at whether it matters for agricultural households. During my field work that I've done in villages, when I speak to agricultural households, I have not seen any agricultural households that is particularly enthralled by the presence of this scheme. They appeared completely indifferent whether the scheme stayed or not, because it was not making any concrete difference to their well-being in material terms. But more importantly, about 75,000 crore is being spent on this scheme. The question is, what are the other requirements in agriculture? What would be the requirement in agriculture to increase public investment? What would be the requirement to increase public spending in areas that matter, for example, in food subsidy or fertilizer subsidy, etc.? Or what would be the expenditure required to actually finance an expansion of the MSP? Recent report actually puts that number at about 21,000 crore only that would be required to finance an expansion of the MSP. But the point is, the expenditure on PM Kisan overwhelms all these expenditures that are required immediately or more urgently in the rural economy. So it takes resources away from capital expenditure. It takes resources away from other pregnant aspects of farmers' welfare and puts it into a very politically loaded kind of a scheme with Prime Minister's name, photo, etc. involved in the campaign related to it, and so on. And the money is actually not spent on other important sort of requirements in the economy. That's one important problem that you see there. If you look at the current budget, which is what you actually sort of for the last part of your question was referring to, the budget essentially continues this trend. This budget does not, from 2019 onwards, the per household payment under PM Kisan has remained exactly the same in nominal terms. So if you consider about 5 to 6% inflation that is there on an annual basis, you have actually seen a very remarkable fall in real terms in these cash transfers to farmer households. So that's the first point, because it's the amount has gone up and down. That's particularly because some exigencies during COVID, but the per household payment has not changed, and it remains at 6,000 rupees. So the real value has really clearly fallen. Outside it, if you see, the major changes in this budget that you see are declines of expenditure on food subsidy and declines of expenditure on fertilizer subsidy and so on. That is one very clear point. In fact, if you remember, I don't know if you remember, in the last year, during a similar online discussion, I had made this point that the allocations made by the union budget on food subsidy, fertilizer subsidy, etc., are extraordinarily inaccurate, okay? In the sense that while much more is required, the expenditure is allocated only at a lower level, okay? And the expenditure is increased in the course of the year as and when a demand arises, whereas it was very clearly known when the budget was presented that these expenditures are going to be required. So you actually keep it deflated for the time being and then increase it. So if you look at budgetary expenditure and revised expenditure in the budgets on certain schemes like food subsidy, fertilizer subsidy, etc., or even MGNREGS over the last 3 or 4 years, revised expenditures are consistently higher than budgetary expenditures, right? In other words, the budget completely underestimated the requirements of food and fertilizer subsidy. And this year also, you're going to see the same thing, because if you look at this year, if you look at fertilizer subsidy, you will see that fertilizer subsidies are to fall from about 1.9 lakh crore in 23-24 to about 1.6 lakh crore in 24-25. That's about 30,000 crore less. If you look at food subsidies, you're going to see a fall from 2.15 lakh crore to about 2 lakh crore. If you look at Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, that expenditure is going to fall from 17,000 crore to about 12,000 crore only. If you look at MGNREGS, well, 86,000 crore rupees is actually the generally spent amount on it on a yearly basis, but it can go up to 90,000 crore, but the expenditure has continued to be kept at 86,000 crore, even though requirements are even more, which essentially shows that in real terms it's going to fall, number one. But number two is that the revised expenditures are certainly going to be higher. The government will be forced to raise it. Now, when revised expenditures are consistently higher than budgetary expenditures, what does this mean? This shows poor budgetary accounting to begin with, but it also shows that at the end of it, you will have to take money from elsewhere to meet these higher revised expenditures, which means that some other sector is going to lose at the end of it. So this kind of a lack of professionalism in budgeting is also a serious problem. So what you clearly see, at a sort of a overall level, at a macroeconomic level, if you see what this budget entails, it is not surprising that this is happening in agriculture. If you look at the direct taxes to GDP ratio or indirect taxes to GDP ratio, it's not going to rise at all between this year and next year. Okay, so taxes or non-tax revenue, both, you take both tax revenue and non-tax revenue. If you add both, they are going to remain the same as a share of the GDP between this year and next year. Okay, so your incomes are not going to rise, but your fiscal deficit is going to fall from 5.8% to 5.1%. There is no magic by which this can happen other than by cutting expenditures, right? So your tax, non-tax revenues as a share of GDP is not rising. It's the same. You're not borrowing also, because your fiscal deficit is coming down rather than remaining the same. As a result, your expenditures must fall, right? And the expenditures will fall everywhere. It will also fall in agriculture. And that is what you're going to see. An indication is there in some of the budgetary estimates, but the actual fall of expenditure that you're likely to see in 24-25 is much, much more than what is presented in the budget. That is the unfortunate part.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Ramakumar. There are so many numbers that we will come back to some of these subsidy questions later. But just to give a flavor to the participants, if you look at the allocation for Department of Agriculture and Farmers Welfare, the budget estimate for 2024-25 is about 1 lakh crore, and of that, 60,000 crore is for PM Kisan, and that constitutes to about 60% of the total allocation for Department of Agriculture and Farmers Welfare. But yeah, we will come back to these questions a little later. But before we take up these specific questions, I would like you to comment briefly about the shifting center-state relations in terms of public expenditure. As we know, there have been some protests by some state governments against the central government in the last few weeks. The Foundation's report also pointed out that the center's share of total expenditure in agriculture has actually reduced over the last decade. This naturally implies that the states have shouldered more development expenditures. How has this shift impacted the functioning of states? And what are its implications for overall agriculture development?
You know, Deepak, the recent protests by Kerala, Karnataka, and Tamil Nadu also in some sense, supported by, the state governments of Delhi, Punjab, and other political leaders from different parts of India, including from Jammu and Kashmir. Farooq Abdullah was also present in one of the protests. So you can see from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, let's say, there is a protest going on on the part of states against certain aspects or certain asymmetries in fiscal federalism, which are counter to the spirit of cooperative fiscal federalism, so to say, which has erupted more recently. If you look closely at some of these protests, their demands, etc., you will see that these protests are essentially against some kind of increasing centralization in center-state relations. Now, increasing centralization of center-state relations is not something new. You had from the 1980s onwards different debates, including the Sarkaria Commission and so on. You had different debates on this going on. But more so in the last 10 years or so, you see a very sharp sort of exacerbation of this problem. right, of centralization, so to say, which is what has troubled many states. Now, this has its roots in both the asymmetries in vertical devolution and horizontal devolution. Vertical devolution means that what the center keeps and how much is given to the states. The horizontal one is how much does each state get out, what is kept for all states. If you consider both these cases, there are issues. Now, I'm going to keep away from horizontal devolution issues because it is more complicated in terms of formulas and so on. And some complaints from Kerala, Karnataka, etc., are very clearly related to the fact that they have performed better in fertility control, population control, in different, they are host to large forest areas and so on. But these constraints of theirs or these achievements of theirs are not adequately reflected in the way they get their devolutions from the center. So that's a problem of horizontal sharing of resources that has been raised. Now, I'm going to keep away from some of that because that becomes too state-wise discussion. I'm going to stick to two very important aspects of center-state relations or vertical devolution issues, which will give you a flavor of how much of a problem this has become. The first issue here is that there is something called the divisible pool or the net proceeds. Now, out of the divisible pool, a certain amount will be kept by the center and a certain amount will be given to the states, all states together. So earlier it was 32%. With the 14th Finance Commission, it was 42%. And the 15th Finance Commission, it was 41%. So that is the share we devolved to the states. Now, if you look at this share, what is most interesting is, even though it is a constitutional obligation on the part of the center to give 32, 42, 41 of the divisible pool to the states, the center has not been giving even this 32, 42, 41% as per FC periods to the states as a whole. That is a serious constitutional impropriety there. Of course, if you can argue in a court that the central government or the union government is not legally bound by the FC recommendations, that is unfortunately the case. It has never been the case in India's history that FC recommendations have been papered over or ignored. That is one very important aspect. So if you look at it, my own calculations actually show that if you look at the period between 2009-10 and 2024-25, okay, the amount that the center has not paid to the states on the whole cumulatively come to close to 6 lakh crore rupees. Cumulatively, okay? So that's the amount that should have been paid to the states between 2009-10 and 24-25 as per FC recommendations, as per constitutional provisions, but that has not been paid. This is one important problem. The second important problem is, I said, of the divisible pool, 32, 42, or 41%, right? But what if the divisible pool itself is shrinking in relative terms, right? What is happening is, and this is purely constitutional, that's an unfortunate problem, right? According to a constitutional amendment that happened in Articles 270 and 271 in the year 2000, what happened was that it was inserted that cesses and surcharges that the center collects need not be part of the divisible pool at all. In other words, they will be kept 100% by the center and not be shared with the states at all. Now, what has happened in the period after 2014-15 is that the share of cesses and surcharges as a share of the gross tax revenue has risen from close to about 11% or so in 2011-12 to about 21 to 22% in the year 21-22. Right? So there is a huge amount that is the center is collecting. Some of it is actually also collected as an agriculture cess. Okay, from 21-22, there is also an agriculture development cess, which is actually going to what is called as the Agricultural Infrastructure Fund, AIF. Right? Now, that cess is also kept by the center. That cess is not shared with the states via the divisible pool. And that and many others, as a road cess, health and education cess, cesses on tea, coffee, sugar, beverage, and other beverages, cesses on different minerals, etc. There are a whole lot of these cesses out there. All of that are kept out of the divisible pool, and they are actually rising and rising as a share of the gross tax revenue. right? So the center is essentially keeping a lot of the an increasing share of the gross tax revenue with it and not sharing with the states, right? So these two problems of vertical devolution, not to speak about other problems of horizontal devolution, have actually seriously affected the state's ability to finance their economies, including agriculture. Right now, there is an additional problem here, which is that of the central sector schemes and centrally sponsored schemes. Now, in those schemes, there are new complexities that have been inserted. For example, of course, from the time that centrally sponsored schemes came, there has been this criticism that these are a backdoor entry of the union into affairs in the state list in the constitution. So essentially, many items in the state list, thanks to central schemes and central sector schemes and centrally sponsored schemes, they were effectively, not de jure, but de facto, taken away from the state list and put in the concurrent list. Though in the constitution, they remain in the state list. So a lot of central sector schemes you will see are actually pertaining to issues in the state list. This is money that should be given in an untied form to states, and they should be spending in whichever sector that they find appropriate or critical. But instead, the center decides. That's also a type of centralization. The center decides on schemes and decides to spend it on states. How much is to be given to each state and not other states is also decided by the center. After the demise of the Planning Commission, this has been decided by the Ministry of Finance, and hence has become a completely political exercise. And the third thing is, many of the guidelines related to these central sector and centrally sponsored schemes are one size fits all. They do not they are not suitable or conducive to the conditions that are obtained in different states. So as a result, what you have is, here again, there is a new dimension of centralization that has crept into center-state relations. In addition to questions of vertical and horizontal devolution, you also have this problem of the rigidity and or the centrally directed nature of central sector schemes and centrally sponsored schemes, where one more issue is there, which is when they began, the resources were being shared on a 90-10 basis. Okay, 90 by center, 10 by states. In most of these schemes, particularly centrally sponsored schemes, you are now at 60-40. Right? States have to spend 40 rupees out of 100 rupees, not 10 rupees, but 40 rupees. Where will that money come from? Even, where will that money come from? Particularly in a context where these issues of vertical devolution are out there, right? The second thing is that in many cases, it's already 50-50, not even 60-40, but it is 50-50. There are some central sector schemes where the states effectively end up spending a lot more than the center, yet the center wants the Prime Minister's photograph, the same color of paint being given to the outputs created as part of the schemes and so on. This is very clearly seen in the Ayushman Bharat Wellness Center component of the schemes that we have at the center. We also have this in the Prime Minister's Awas Yojana, where houses have to be painted or with a different color, and Prime Minister's photo has been put. So you look at all these things. There is a serious problem of centralization. Okay, and that has become a very major political controversy. That has become a very important political controversy of our times, and the protest by chief ministers that you saw is actually an important part of it. Now here, we are talking here about agriculture. Let me close with this point, which is that in agriculture also this is affecting very badly. For example, this essentially shrinks the amount that is available with the states for spending in agriculture. This shrinks the extent of money that is available with the states to spend on agriculture in a context-specific manner. Suppose you want to have schemes for different agroclimatic zones within your state as per requirement. None of this money is going to be useful because the guidelines are completely different, right? I'll give you one example and close my answer, which is that of under the Department of Water Resources, there is a scheme called Har Khet Ko Pani. Okay, in Har Khet Ko Pani guideline, it is very clearly said in rural areas, it basically is a scheme where ponds are built. Ponds are dug and sort of maintained over a period. Now, the minimum size of the pond should be at least 13 to 15 acres, according to the guidelines. Right now, I work with the State Planning Board in Kerala, where we found that you simply cannot have a pond in rural Kerala which is of a size of 13 acres. Right? As a result, the whole scheme goes out of the window as far as Kerala is concerned. You cannot use a single rupee out of this project because you cannot have a pond of 13 acres in size. So these are issues of very of serious importance in these center-state relations, including in agriculture, which needs urgent and serious reform in the coming years if cooperative fiscal federalism and its spirit are to be maintained.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Ramakumar. There are many issues to be discussed, and we are slightly running out of time. And I just took a peek at the Q&A box. I think we'll combine some of those questions which have been raised by the participants along with the questions that I had prepared. One of the questions that have come up is particularly regarding the food subsidy. And we are coming back to the interim budget here. And you wrote a year ago that in comparison with the food subsidy allocation in 2022-23, it was almost reduced by 45% in 2023-24. And when we come to the allocation for 2024-2025, we see a reduction in comparison with the revised estimates, which is going to be somewhat closer to what is actually going to be spent for this year. Now, this is not accounted for under the Ministry of Agriculture, and but we nevertheless know that this drop in reduction will affect the farming population. Now, I want you to answer two sub-questions regarding this. Like, why was there a sudden spurt in spending in the interim period, 2022 and 2021, around that? And now when we see a reduced allocation, what will be the effect of it? Now, we have a few more questions, but maybe we can have brief answers and then take up other issues during the Q&A.
Deepak, these two issues, the food subsidy and fertilizer subsidy, it must be very clear why the trends that you mentioned you see such trends. The period of COVID saw a measure which is called the Prime Minister's Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana, which essentially increased the allocation per head of rice and wheat by 5 kg and made it free of cost, and also the addition of pulses into the PDS basket. You saw these two measures during COVID. This is the reason why you saw a significant rise of food subsidy during the period of COVID, because if you keep it in the FCI go down, it does not lead to food subsidy. But the moment you give it to people, it will appear in the budget accounts as a food subsidy. And ironically, that's one of the reasons why governments would prefer to keep grains rotting in the FCI go downs and not give it to people for free, because it will come up as a also automatically push up the fiscal deficit. Okay, so these are the two reasons why, ironically, governments like the food grains to rot and not people to eat. Okay, now let that be so. But the point is that the period after 22-23 saw the end of this scheme, and you have now come back to 5 kg per head as the allocation under PDS, but this has been made free. So instead of 2 or 3 rupees per kg that used to prevail earlier for about 80 to 90 crore households, you now have 0 rupees per kg for 80 to 90 crore households as per the NFSA. This is the reason why the food so first you had, before COVID, you had only 5 kg per head at 2 to 3 rupees per kg. During COVID, you had 5 kg at 2 to 3 rupees kg and 5 kg at 0 rupees per kg for about 2 or 3 years. Then you now come back to 5 kg, but not at 2 to 3 rupees per kg, but at 0 rupees per kg. That's we don't know how long that will sort of continue. Probably after May 2024, there is likely to be a change in the pricing regime of this. But the point is that these are the reasons why the food subsidy bill has been going up and down. Now, the food subsidy bill has been coming down now because pulses are no more being given through the PDS, and the Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana has been sort of compressed in size. Instead of 10 kg, it's only 5 kg. This is one reason why the food subsidy bill has come down, as you see in the budget documents. But that's a problem because when you actually gave 10 kg during COVID, you saw the requirement for it out there, right? In fact, I mean, people wanted that full allocation to be taken in, and the situation has not much changed after COVID. Though some people have gone back to urban households, urban areas for work and so on. The rural unemployment and the fall of rural real wages, etc., continue to be problems that remain with us. So it's important that it should have remained 10 kg per head, yeah, even during the current year, but it is the cut of that amount that is essentially being reflected as a fall in food subsidy. The second is fertilizer subsidy. If you look closely at fertilizer subsidy, the reason why they rose is because fertilizer prices rose. Particularly after the war in Ukraine and so on, the fertilizer prices, imported prices of fertilizer rose rapidly, which meant that if you wanted to keep the fertilizer prices constant, fertilizer subsidies should have risen very rapidly. Now, what the government did was to look for a halfway solution. It allowed fertilizer prices at the consumer level to rise to some extent, and rest of it was absorbed as a higher fertilizer subsidy. So you saw a higher fertilizer subsidy. At the same time, fertilizer prices nevertheless rose as well, because all of the rise in prices was not absorbed into fertilizer subsidy. So farmers' woes remain, fertilizer subsidies rise, and the problem remains the problem at hand essentially remains the same. So these are the reasons why you see food and fertilizer subsidies going up and down. The government clearly has cut these two for the next year, and it is actually expecting that the war will sort of subside or in its intensity and so on, and goods will start moving more easily, and prices may fall, and they may actually need to spend less. But past experience says that prices nevertheless do rise, and the requirements of subsidies also rise. That's why I earlier referred to it as poor budgetary accounting exercise.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. So just to give some numbers from this budget estimates, food subsidy is about 2 lakh crore, and fertilizer is about 1.6 lakh crore. And together they constitute near about 3.6 lakh crore. So now, before we go into other questions, the one question which is there in the Q&A and which always comes up is this effectiveness of this support. Now, there is an argument which is somewhat popular right now among some sections of economists, that the sectors that have received least institutional support within agriculture, such as fisheries and animal husbandry, you talked about in your previous articles, there is a increase in incomes. If not for crop, there is something that has gone well for animal husbandry. Now, given this, do you think there is a need for reprioritizing support away from the areas where subsidy is provided now, given that these areas which are given support is not performing up to the marks?
This is a very interesting question. Nobody realizes the basic of maths that they studied in schools, that if the base is actually low, growth rates will be very high. So essentially it's actually a base effect that is being seen as very high growth rates in livestock and fisheries as compared to the crop agriculture. The reason is that if you look at the period after about the early 2000s and so on, there is a very clear shift in consumer preferences in the diets in Indian households. But rice, wheat, etc., continue to be eaten as the staple forms of items, but you also see increasing amounts of fish, egg, milk, and meat being consumed by households of all income classes in India, including rural areas, over the last about 20 years. That has been a consistently rising trend, but it's not been a rapidly rising trend. It has been a steadily but decisively rising trend. So more of this is being consumed. So essentially, there is more demand for fish, meat, milk, and eggs in the Indian economy over the last 20 years. And that has resulted in upturn in prices. So the demand is out there, and you got supply coming in to meet some of this. And that's what essentially you see as higher growth rates. Now, if you look at the dairy sector in particular, we forget that they have a established marketing structure. They have a well-established aggregation structure. They have a well-established marketing structure. They have also a well-established retail retail structure at the consumer level. Right? And that's from the the White Revolution days. We have built it on a cooperative basis in India, and that has helped sustaining the growth rates of the dairy sector and so on. So it's not exactly correct to say that no support system exists in sectors like dairy. The dairy cooperatives provide significant amount of subsidy and other forms of support to farmers. The government also has schemes which meet some of the specific infrastructural needs in these areas. So that is one. And in fisheries, a lot of it is marine fisheries, where you see the expansion of deep sea fishing also in many ways. There are also some states, like for example, Andhra Pradesh, which have seen, or Odisha, which are seeing very sharp rises in the growth rates of inland aquaculture or inland brackish water aquaculture. In both these cases, some of these states are actually spending, these are actually state government efforts, not the center has very little to do with that. The state governments have come in and spent a lot of money. Another important state is Kerala, which has also begun to see a rapidly rising growth rate in fisheries sector, both in the marine and inland sector. So you basically put all this together, you see from a low base rate, higher growth rate in fisheries also. But once the growth rate of fisheries reaches a particular threshold level and crosses it, you will see that the need for support, as in the case of agriculture and crops, would arise there as well. I mean, you cannot simply assume that these growth rates will continue without government support for a long time. It's very good and remarkable that they're growing, and I mean, it needs to be welcomed. But at the same time, we need to understand the specificities of dairy and fisheries as distinct from crop agriculture, which have a very different demand cycle, which have a very different crop cycle, which have a very different growing cycle, and so on. And that needs to be kept in mind. But no doubt, the budgetary expenditures on dairy and fisheries need to go up much more than what they've actually grown.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. But that is a very important point to see things at a detailed level rather than seeing just the growth rate, but look at the absolute number and look at the value of output in the sectors and then make a comparison based on that. Thank you for that answer. Now, there is one participant who has asked a question about the capital formation. And I think we should take that up, because one of the claims made along with the budget was the record level of allocation for capital expenditure. Now, public investment is necessary for capital formation, and such an increase, if that has to be believed, to the tune of 11 lakh crore, will also have some spillover effect to agriculture sector, which can be reasonably expected. Now, how do you see these expenditures? First of all, what has been the trend in your evaluation? Has there been a noticeable change in overall capital expenditure? And within agriculture, so to speak of, do you see any specific change in capital expenditure that is budgeted?
Okay, now coming to the capital expenditure story, there is an overall narrative going around that the capital expenditure of the union government has significantly risen in the recent years. And the argument often put forward is that from about 2018-19 onwards, they have risen by about 25% per annum. And that is something unheard of, unprecedented in independent India. And the government has been claiming a lot of credit for it. But the devil is in the details, as we say. What is not considered at all in many of the media narratives that you see is the following 4 or 5 points. The first is that all the loans and advances given to state governments are actually put as capital expenditure in the budget accounts. Right? Now, loans and advances given to state governments also includes a new animal after 2018-19, which is the GST compensation cess. Right? So that needs to be factored in if we are looking at overall capital expenditure. And all loans and advances given to states are not necessarily going to end up as capital expenditure. A lot of it can actually end up as pure revenue expenditures also. Number two is that expenditures like purchase of armaments in defense are actually also counted as capital expenditure, whereas most of it is actually imported and not produced in India. So they are not capital expenditures incurred for asset creation in India, but actually outside India. But they are also counted as capital expenditure in the budgetary accounts. Number three is that when a company like Air India was sold, the government actually spent about 60,000 crore rupees to wipe off its debt before giving it to Tatas. That 60,000 crore is actually a capital expenditure in the budget accounts. Number four, when the government decided to infuse equity into BSNL, MTNL, etc., which was purely to pay their past debts, they were also counted as, or they are being counted as, capital expenditures in the budget account, right? Finally, the Finance Commission, the 16th Finance Commission, gave a very clear stricture that internal and extra budgetary borrowings of the government must be treated as part of the fiscal deficit. Right? Now, in other words, off-budget borrowings, where the government stands security, must be treated as part of the government's borrowing. As you know, Kerala has gone to the Supreme Court with a case related to KIFBI. Right? The 16th Finance Commission's recommendation essentially applies to center as well. Right? So a lot of the internal and extra budgetary resources of PSUs of the central government were in one go transferred to the budget accounts. Right? So all of that suddenly came up as higher capital expenditures. So many calculations actually show that if you deduct for all these things, if you deduct loans and advances, if you deduct IBR, if you deduct Air India, BSNL, MTNL, etc., only if the government claims 100 rupees is the increase in capital expenditure, only about 40 rupees of that 100 rupees is actually capital expenditure. So accounting for all these things, it is not 25% growth rate per year that you actually see. Only about 5% growth rate is the growth rate of capital expenditure that is the reality out there. So this whole increase of capital expenditure story that we hear about the economy as a whole is an illusion. You actually look at the details, you will very clearly know that these capital expenditures have not taken place. And this is not to say that this 5% increase, a lot of it has gone into highways, railways, and so on. I'm not denying any of that. That has happened, but not to the extent that the government is claiming, number one. Number two, coming to agriculture. Here is where the catch lies, because as you know, increase in productivity is a very important goal in agriculture. Now, if you actually see what is happening in the public investment in agricultural research, look at developed countries. They invest close to 2 to 3% of their agricultural GDP in public agricultural research. 2 to 3%. An emerging economy like Brazil invests close to 1.4% of its agricultural GDP in agricultural research. Take all developing countries together, they invest close to 0.7% of their agricultural GDP in public agricultural research. But where is India? India invests only 0.6% of its agricultural GDP in agricultural research, which is actually lower than the average for all developing countries taken together. It's a pathetic situation out there. Go to any agricultural research station in India, the director of that institute will complain to you that no new post has been sanctioned here for the last 10 years. Somebody has retired, no new appointment has taken place. Earlier, we had 10 staff here. Now we have only 4 staff. So as a result, we are not able to do field trials properly. As a result, we are not able to do extension work properly, research work properly. So all these problems have exacerbated because of poor levels of public expenditure on agricultural research, also on agricultural extension. Now, even last week, I was in a Maharashtra village and I was talking to an input dealer, and I saw 2 farmers coming to him and essentially asking, I've got this pest in my field. Can you tell me what to apply? The guy was so happy, recommending his 2 most expensive pesticides to the farmers. though I'm not competent to say whether they would have worked or not. But essentially, you have left extension to private input dealers and away from public agricultural extension. This is also an outcome of poor levels of agricultural extension investment. So agricultural investment so capital expenditure in agriculture is one, it happens in irrigation and so on, which has stagnated for a very long time. Then it happens in research and extension. Here again, it has stagnated and is lower than the developing country average, as we know. So you urgently need a stepping up of these investments if you are going to go anywhere near your target of narrowing your yield gaps.
Thank you, Professor Ramakumar. Actually, I had a few more questions, but I think we are running out of time. So we'll take up some questions from the participants who have who have typed their queries in the chat box. So I think some of them we have answered in the previous discussion. So one question which I think is very useful because it follows from the point that you just made, which is asked by Priya Chetri. Like, we talk about subsidies on fertilizer and electricity, but there is an important concern about how this affects the sustainability issues, like excessive use of chemicals in our food affecting soil quality and overuse of groundwater due to cheaper groundwater pumping sources, etc. What are your view on these complex interactions?
Okay, now this is something that is discussed again and again. And let me try to answer this question from the perspective of Punjab. Okay, I'm just taking an example here. Now, Punjab is a much villainized state in India because you think that everybody thinks that Punjab agriculture is in serious crisis. Punjab agriculture, Punjab soils are poisonous. Punjab people are dying of cancer. Punjab people are doing this, doing that. And there are a lot of stories you'll hear about Punjab agriculture. Let me take two, three, four indicators of Punjab agriculture. Now, has productivity levels in Punjab begun to stagnate, or are they falling, as some people are actually pointing out? Data shows no. I'm going to take decadal averages just to sort of give a flavor of the trends. Take wheat. Okay, the wheat productivity has consistently risen from the 1960s in Punjab. From 2011, in the first decade of the 21st century, that is 2000s, as I would call it, the productivity on an average was about 4,352 kilograms per hectare of wheat. It is now 4,900 kilograms per hectare. Okay, so in the second decade, so you see a rise of productivity there. Take paddy, you see a rise in productivity from, I'm going to speak about 2 decades for all my figures, 2000s and 2010s. Okay, I mean, just to sort of preface it. So the paddy productivity has risen from 5,744 kg per hectare in the 2000s to 6,100 kilograms per hectare in the 2010s. Maize productivity 3,000 to 3,800 kg per hectare. Cotton productivity 634 to 667, and sugarcane productivity from 596 to 769 quintals per hectare. So all productivities are continuing to rise in Punjab. We can call about growth rates of rise and so on, but Punjab productivities are rising irrespective of what the narrative elsewhere about Punjab is. Second is that perception that Punjab soils are poisoned and are being completely destroyed by fertilizers and so on. So one important indicator that you can take is the extent of soil organic carbon in Punjab soils. Okay, that's a very, very simple indicator to take because all these fertilizers, etc., and absence of green manure, etc., are supposed to destroy soil organic carbon. And that's what is often said to be a big problem. What has happened to soil organic carbon status? The share of soils of Punjab with low organic carbon have fallen from 78% in the 1980s to about 55% today. And the share of soils which have high levels of organic carbon was only 1% in the 1980s. It is now 15% in Punjab. So the share of soils with high and medium levels of organic carbon are growing, and the share of soils with low organic carbon is falling in Punjab. This is the second interesting trend that you see. And the third interesting trend that I want to bring to your notice is fertilizer use and pesticide use. Okay, there is efficient fertilizer management today. The fertilizer use in Punjab was close to 252 kilograms per hectare in 2011-12. Today, it is only 242 kilograms per hectare, 10 kg less per hectare. This is because of increasing awareness among farmers that overuse of fertilizers can be a problem. Take pesticide use. Similarly, you see the total use of insecticides was close to 3,800 metric tons in 2001-2. Now, they are only about 1,900 metric tons in use in Punjab. So fertilizers are coming down, pesticides are coming down, soil organic carbon is going up. Okay, and if the extent of pesticide residue in food items, that is only 3%. In only 3% of the samples do you see any increased presence above MRL of pesticides in ppm terms. So that is also not a big problem in Punjab. And even if you look at other states which are rising in productivity, say which are the fastest growing agricultural states of India? Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, etc. These are the states which are growing. Their productivity levels in rice, wheat, maize, whichever crop you take, they have today only reached those levels of productivity which Punjab already had attained in 1981-82. Right? So they are far, far away from where Punjab is, and Punjab is continuing to. So this whole narrative about sustainability and all is often not quite scientific, offered not quite from a scientific perspective. Increased application of fertilizers is judiciously done, is not necessarily bad for soil, can actually contribute to increased soil organic carbon, can actually lead to higher productivity, which are very important. Let me close with the statement that if your productivity does not rise, your increased requirements in the future can only be met by cutting down forests.
Yeah. So thank you, Professor Ramakumar. We are coming to the closing of this session, but since there are many participants and there are a few more questions, with permission of the organizers, I would like to extend it for maybe 5 to 10 more minutes, and then we can take up a few more questions. One question in relation to, so I'm taking that we can go ahead with that plan. One question in relation to
Deepak, just sorry,
yeah, sure.
If you can conclude to maybe
The
another
headmaster
5
has
minutes.
come.
5 minutes, please. Yeah.
Yeah,
maybe
sure.
5 to 7 minutes. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. So maybe I will take up two questions. One question which is commonly raised by Professor Nasir Khan and Ajil Mankundamal is about the organic farming, and the government is thinking about reducing chemical fertilizer, which is related to your question whether organic farming has a future, and considering that this is something that is even after considering for everything, whether it can become a viable alternative to chemical pesticides and fertilizers. Now, the second question with which we will close the session is by Teresa Scaria. It's about your opinion on farmer producer companies, which some people have talked about, and there are some specific schemes which have been announced by the finance minister about empowering women and making sure that self-help groups and farmer producer companies would come up and would lead to some sort of job creation as well as some sort of income enhancement. So with these two questions, I think we can wind up.
Okay, so the question on organic farming is, we have answered from the FAS platform for many years now. The consensus view across the world is that organic farming or natural farming, it's for a cousin out there, both of them lead to a fall of productivity by about 30 to 40% in crops on an average. That is the scientific consensus that exists very clearly. Now, this kind of a reduction in productivity has serious implications for food security in our country. It also has implications in a different sense, because let us consider the discussion that is often held about Punjab again. I'm coming back to Punjab as an illustration. Paddy is cultivated in Punjab, which is not suitable there. Paddy has to be taken out of Punjab because it's a water guzzling crop in Punjab and so on. Punjab will become a desert. That's I've heard people saying so. So this essentially means that if you want to take paddy out of Punjab, okay, you can take that. There is no problem. You can have maize or cotton or something else there. But the requirement for that, if overall food security concerns of India are not adversely affected, are not to be adversely affected, is that productivity levels of paddy and wheat in other parts of India must rise. Right? Only if productivity levels of paddy and wheat in other parts of India decisively rise, can you be able to release more paddy and wheat land from Punjab for whatever you want to do, pulses, so oil seeds, millets, whatever you want to do. That release of land will be possible only with higher productivity. And that's again another point that we need to keep in mind when we speak of alternatives like organic farming or natural farming. Judiciously done, none of this is bad for health. None of this is bad for soils. In fact, if you follow scientific prescriptions which prescribe both organic manure and nitrogen, phosphorus, potash, and other fertilizers in scientifically harmonious ratios, your soil will be safe. Public health will also be safe. That is very important to note. The second point is about farmer producer companies. That is very important because India, we have large numbers of very small marginal farmers, which essentially means that they do not have a surplus which is viable enough to be transported to a nearby mandi to get a good price, or to be sold to a proper agro-processing center for a value-added enterprise and hence get a higher price and so on. The farmer is a prisoner of the itinerant trader in the village because the produce is so small and hence it needs an aggregator. So we need some aggregator out there who will aggregate the produce of the farmer so that they can get better prices and their products are better linked to value addition and agro-business. That's absolutely correct. And that's where farmer producer companies come into play. They are one important tool that we have other than cooperatives, self-help groups, etc., which are already there. Now, the government had given a target of 10,000 farmer producer companies in India 2 years back, but it is very far from meeting that target, number one. Number two, many farmer producer companies have been started without adequate hand-holding or training. As a result, they have perished, they have become dormant, and they only exist on paper, they do not work on the ground. And third is they have not been adequately linked to value addition in agriculture or industry, as a result of which they exist while they do not contribute much vis-a-vis their the objectives for which they were actually formed. So farmer producer companies have not been formed in adequate numbers. They have not been trained and handheld to become proper entrepreneurial units, and you have not connected them adequately to value addition. So these three problems remain as stark, outstanding issues in the field of farmer producer companies in agriculture.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Ramakumar. We have come to a close of the session, so we cannot take up further questions, but there are some interesting questions about Russia-Ukraine war, the contribution of agriculture to the future growth of economy, about the implications for upcoming elections, all of which we are unable to take because of want of time, but we would definitely like to take up these in future sessions sometime, if time permits. And some of the issues which Professor Ramakumar have raised and which have come up in the discussion have been answered in part, or various aspects of it have been discussed in articles in Review of Agrarian Studies, which is the journal published by the Foundation for Agrarian Studies. And I would request Utkarsh and other members of Foundation for Agrarian Studies to please share the link to the journal in the chat box so that the participants can take a look at it once they leave. So Professor V.K. Ramachandran, do you want to add to the discussion? Do you have any final comments?
There's no time now.
You are muted. Yeah.
I suggest there's no time now. We should.
Right. Yeah, sure. So, so with that, yeah. So, thank you, Professor Ramakumar, once again. And with that, we hand it over to Sandeepan and Utkarsh.
Thank you, Deepak. I shall only take a couple of minutes to present the vote of thanks. But before that, I wish to apologize that because of the constraint of time, we could not take all the questions that came here. But we assure you that we shall share all the questions that we have come in the question answer box with Professor Ramakumar after the session. So, yeah. Thank you, Professor Ramakumar and Dr. Deepak Johnson for this enriching discussion. I'm thankful to the online team at FAS, which is responsible for this event. Rakesh, Sai, Setu, Sandeepan, and Tapas for their role in conducting this webinar very smoothly. I convey my special thanks to Rahul from Free Software Movement of Karnataka for his help in technical management of the seminar. Our special thanks are also due to numerous academic and research collaborators of FAS who helped us spread the word about this webinar. Last but not the least, we are grateful to all the attendees for participating and making this a lively discussion. As mentioned earlier, a recording of this session will be made available on YouTube shortly. To know more about the foundation and the work we do, please visit our website fas.org.in. We are also on social media. You can find us at FAS Agri Studies on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. I request that you follow us on these platforms to not just get updates about our events, but also about our work. We'll be ending this session with this. Once again, thank you all very much for your participation and the discussion. Have a good evening. I'm sharing the link of our journal in the chat box for those who want. They can. I've just shared it. You can take it from the chat box. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Utkarsh. But may I just take a moment to thank Utkarsh for for working for the last 1 week consistently or for the success of this online discussion. Thank you, Utkarsh. Okay, with that, have a good evening and bye-bye from us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.